Thank you for downloading this episode of In Our Time. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/radio4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello, in 1799, Ranjit Singh and his Sikh army captured Lahore, once the Mughal capital of the north. He was 18 years old. His coronation as Maharaja, or Great King, 2 years later, marked the start of the Sikh Empire. At its peak, the empire covered the Punjab and stretched from the Khyber Pass in the west to the edge of Tibet in the east, up to Kashmir and down to Mithankop on the Indus River. Ranjit Singh was at the heart of it. Known as the Lion of the Punjab, he was the one who united separate factions into one powerful state. He put the gold on the Golden Temple at Amritsar. With his death in 1839, though, the Sikh Empire weakened. There were 2 wars with the British in a decade, and 50 years after it was first established, the empire was dissolved, even if the influence of Ranjit Singh's military power is still felt today. With me to discuss the Sikh Empire are Gurpal Singh, Professor in Interreligious Relations and Development at SOAS, University of London, Chandrika Kaul, Lecturer in Modern History at the University of St Andrews, and Susan Strong, Senior Curator in the Asian Department of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Gurpal Singh, what are the origins of Sikhism?
Well, Sikh refers to, the term Sikh refers to disciple or follower. And Sikh tradition normally dates the origins of Sikhism from 1469 with the birth of the first Guru Nanak, who was born 60 miles southwest of current-day Lahore. Guru Nanak was born at a time of significant social and religious change in northern India, particularly change amongst subaltern religious groups who questioned orthodoxies of Hinduism and Islam. And within his lifetime, he was able to attract a significant following. Nanak's thought is distinguished by his emphasis on equality, what we today called lived religions, of living in this world to make a change, and the emphasis on sharing one's labours. He was followed by 9 other gurus, and in the 150 years after his death in 1539, one sees the emergence of the Sikh tradition from a sort of internal pacifist following to a more militant tradition.
He was very decisive in his views. It was extraordinary, the agenda he brought to it, as it were, from the beginning. He believed in monotheism, he was against the caste system, he believed in equality of all people, and he believed in religious tolerance. And that theme went through and has kept going through Sikhism. Who were his followers, and how did the following of Sikhism grow?
Well, his followers were initially within the Punjab rural community, mainly mainly those from normal farming community from lower caste and indeed of higher caste. But his message was very appealing. In a sense, it struck a chord with the idiom of the time for equality, for gender equality, indeed, and for change, and for a new kind of Protestant, kind of reformist vision of religion, one that was relevant to contemporary change. And the growth of Sikhism occurs throughout the 16th and 17th century, as more and more Jats, these are rural yeoman farmers who are attracted to the tradition, partly because of the message and its appeal, but also because of political change, which occurs mostly in the 17th century.
Were there places built that they could go and worship in? And so what was the setup?
Well, after Nanak's death, Sikhism becomes a larger tradition. There are places of pilgrimage are established. Amritsar is founded by the third Guru, Guru Ram Das, and then the fifth Guru constructs the current, or not the current, but the Golden Temple, or the foundations of the Golden Temple are laid. So as the community grows, the pilgrimage sites and institutions are built, and then indeed the holy book, the Adi Granth, is compiled, and then subsequently in the persecution of the Sikh Gurus, in particular the fifth Guru, Guru Arjan, who's martyred in Lahore, and the death of the ninth Guru leads to the transformation of the tradition.
And that's a good segue. Thank you very much for doing my job for me. All help, welcome. Chandrika Kaul, how did these Sikh people then begin? As was just been said, how did their tradition change? Let's say, how did they become political as well as religious?
Well, I think it's quite important to stress that they were always political. When, for instance, Amritsar, the land for Amritsar was granted by Akbar, and this is going back to 1580, Ramdas, the guru at that time, soon set about trying to collect taxes, impose a certain kind of political order amongst his disciples to begin with, and so on. But by the time you come to the beginning of the 18th century, the last guru, so essentially late 17th and beginning of the 18th century, you have the last guru. And he essentially, due to a number of reasons, begins to try and build on Nanak's tradition by imposing a certain political agenda to the spiritual message. So while all the things that Guru Harpal just talked about continue, he also adds, and I'm really simplifying this to one particular element, he adds the idea of opposition to political wrong. And in that case, in this case specifically, it was the Mughals he was opposing. And he essentially, for instance, writes this very famous epistle called Zafarnama, in which he sort of points out to the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb the kind of hollowness, the moral and spiritual hollowness of his regime. So the idea of fighting injustice with force of arms is something that he actually inculcates within his followers and within the wider, hopefully, Punjabi community. I just want to quickly add that I think it's really important to stress that the Sikhs throughout this period were a minority, even though the numbers increased. And essentially, this was this part of the country was dominated by Muslims. This was 70% Muslim and Hindus. So one of the very important aspects of bringing a political community together was to try and appeal above, in a way, faith and caste, and have a kind of regional, national political identity. A regional identity. And gurus like the last guru tried to do that.
You've said 70% Muslims and we're told 20% Hindus, so that leaves about at most 10% for the Sikhs. So a very small proportion had a very big effect. So how did they organise to have such a great effect? How did they politically organise? Coming back almost to the original question.
Well, I think what begins to happen is that these percentages change because the converts are taken from Muslims. Muslims and Hindus convert to Sikhism too. So we're talking about a slight change of numbers by the time you come to the end of the...
It's like, may I interrupt? I'm reading probably from your notes. But one of the remarkable things is that the Ranjit, he brought in Muslims and Hindus. He managed to equalise that and although a few people changed to Sikhism remained, and I think this is important for the conversation, a very small minority, and yet with enormous effect. That's the interesting thing, or one of them.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this really goes down to two aspects. One, that they were given, if you focus it down on Ranjit Singh now, they were given roles within the military, the Khalsa, the militarized wing of Sikhism, in far larger proportion to their population numbers would suggest. They were also given posts within the civilian administration in far greater numbers than perhaps their population would suggest. So there was certainly a sense in which they were brought in to the administration.
I don't want to leave the Mughals too soon. You said they opposed what the Mughals were up to. The Mughals, this mighty empire, we know lots and lots about them. What did they oppose?
Various kinds of oppression, including religious persecution too, because obviously, as Guru Harpal has said, the idea of Sikhism was to try and find the commonality within religion rather than the distinction. So they always said that their opposition to the Mughals was not, it wasn't a sort of Muslim opposition. It was particularly linked to what the Mughals were doing in terms of, how they were oppressing cultivators, the persecution of religious minorities, and all kinds of oppressive taxation and so on. So this was a social political opposition rather than a religious one, and the gurus are very clear on that front.
Susan Strong, can you just develop the idea of the Mughals? They'd been there for a long time, and we're talking about moving into the 17th, 18th century now. What impact had they had?
Well, the impact on the region was profound, and it continued into the Sikh period. If you look, for instance, at language, the language of the Mughal Empire was Persian. It was the language. They were Central Asian invaders. They brought with them the Persian language and Iranian culture, which profoundly shaped Mughal court culture. The Persian language was used as the language of the administration of the entire empire, including the province of Punjab. And Punjab is Persian, it's Panjab, referring to the 5 rivers that flow across the plains. And the language continued to be used at the Sikh court of Ranjit Singh. So the histories of his reign were also written in Persian. And there's a legacy, there's a direct link, an echo of the great age of Shah Jahan in the 17th century in the Sikh history of Ranjit Singh, where he too is referred to as Shah Jahan, king of the world. So that goes on. The capital of the province, which was a Mughal province, is Lahore. That was of immense strategic and economic importance. It was at a crossroads of trading routes, and because of the trading routes, it allowed invaders also to come into the subcontinent. So Lahore had to be heavily fortified. It was of great economic importance, as I just said, but because the Mughals lived there for weeks, months, years even, they left a deep architectural legacy as well. So within the fortified structures of the palace buildings for the Mughals were also the halls of public and private audience and a mosque, a huge mosque erected by Alamgir, Aurangzeb. And Ranjit Singh, when he took Lahore, lived in these very same buildings.
He, as he often did, I mean, he was an extraordinary man in many ways, in almost every way we could think of. But diplomatically, he was very clever. Instead of crushing people, he brought them on his side again and again. And he went inside the husk of the Mughal Empire, didn't he? He took on its trappings. When people painted him, portraits, it was of a Mughal Maharaja.
Very consciously, in the secular life of the
because
court,
these are the mighty people, and he wanted not to demolish them, but to inhabit them and then take them into his own.
To be seen, to allude very consciously to the great imperial past and position himself, his own power within that. But it's true, absolutely, that he brought into the running of his kingdom leading Muslim figures, Hindu figures, who were part of his inner circle, his most intimate advisors and companions. And it's a testament, I think, to the charisma, as we would put it now, of his personality, that he was able to control all these fighting factions of Sikhs, but also impose this rule which brought in everybody else.
How turbulent is the Punjab at this time? Let's talk about the end of the 18th century. This boy, youth, and he has been, he's the leader. He becomes a Maharaja when he's about 20. Against all the odds, he's tremendously successful. He isn't pushed around by anybody, and he's very skillful in all sorts of ways. But he faced a turbulent. The Punjab was in a turbulence because of the declining power of the Mughals. Is that right? That's
absolutely right. Throughout the 18th century, as the great Mughal Empire declined, the situation in the Punjab was desperate, because it was Mughal power had virtually disappeared throughout the 18th century. The raid of Nadir Shah of Iran in 1738-9 through the Punjab on Delhi to seize the Mughal treasures and then take them back to Iran had a devastating blow on the power and the economics of the empire. So this allowed other regional powers to rise if they had a strong enough leader and a strong enough army. The situation in the Punjab was that it was repeatedly invaded by Afghans who devastated monuments, including the Golden Temple, which was destroyed 3 times and then rebuilt. So because the Sikh missals, the clans, were established and fighting between themselves, there was no possibility of uniting to defeat and control all the land. And it was only Ranjit Singh who was able to do that, incredibly, given, as you say, his very young age. But he had a very strong advisor in the women of his family, about whom I think rather little is known.
Can I come back to you then, Gopal Singh? He's well prepared, we've been told by Susan there. Can you just fill us in on what we know of him at that young age when he came to that position?
He was born in 1780, and he was the son.
He takes Lahore in 1799.
1799, yeah. But he's a son of a Sikh clan leader. And at a very young age, he's inducted into the warfare, and he sees action at the age of 9, and he's led to won a major victory as his father is dying. And then he marries at the age of 15, and this is, I think, is a very important aspect which Susan has alluded to, is that he's influenced incredibly by his mother-in-law of his first marriage, who becomes his advisor and guardian. And then 2 years later, he marries again with a daughter of another clan leader. So he's in a sense developing his connections and his networks within the missiles in order to marginalize his opponents. He's also shows his political leadership of his group in defeating or at least arresting the extension of power of Shah Zaman and the King of Afghanistan, who enters
he must be one of the few people on the planet who actually stopped and conquered the Afghans.
Well, absolutely. I know. I think one of the claims that is often made is that with Ranjit Singh later on in his reign, that the Afghans are at least held back and pushed back for some time.
You're probably too tactful to say this, so I hope I can say it, because it is important, I think, in the scheme of things, although it's at the periphery of the spectrum, is that he was underappreciated, particularly by the snobocracy, the British, because he was only, as it were, 5'3", same height as Napoleon, as it happens, and he'd been blinded in one eye with smallpox when he was a boy. And he seemed, according to one ridiculous remark by an English lady, a little grey mouse. Well, he was some mouse, wasn't he?
Well, he was some mouse, but he was a mouse who had the brain of, I think, Machiavelli, and at least the intuitive intelligence of a great diplomat, as well as a political leader. You're
absolutely brilliant at giving me segues, because exactly I was going to... I mean, will you go again?
Sorry.
It's all right. Chandrika, so how did Ranjit manage to unite the Sikhs in his empire?
Well, I think it's really important just to finish up on that he was really quite fortuitous. It was for him that the Afghans, the Afghans themselves were riven at this point, and they were having lots of problems in their own part of the world. So their gaze was, taken away from the Punjab. Also, we have the idea of what was happening in Europe. Napoleon is the conquering hero. He has subdued Russia, and there is this threat of a French-Russian pact, which would allow Russia, if it so wanted, to invade through the routes of the Afghan frontier.
And that threat didn't last more than 10 minutes, did it? I mean, he left Russia.
I know, but the point was that for the British, you mentioned the British. I think that for Britain, for the East India Company, they realised that it was far more helpful to have Ranjit Singh and his territory as a buffer between this possible combined invasion of sort of Russia and France. I mean, this might have been a red herring.
It is a red herring.
But the point is, the commanders on the ground felt that this policy of wait and see rather than attack Ranjit Singh, that decision was taken by if you like, head office in London.
Can I ask my original question, which was how did he manage to unite the Sikhs in his empire? Because there were lots of Sikhs, as Susan pointed out in her knowledge. They weren't just one grouping in one area of the Punjab, they were all over the place. How did he manage to unite them in the first place?
Through a combination of strength of personality and policy. I think to one extent it was about using his prowess as a military commander to subdue those who wouldn't agree to accept him. But combined with that, he was very happy to take money off them, to have them as vassals on the threat of invasion. So the superiority of the army, into which he put a lot of money and a lot of thought. He had Europeans coming in and training his army. So certainly
French, not British. Yeah,
indeed, French and Italian.
French fleeing from the defeated Napoleon.
Yes, indeed. Ventura and Attard were two very prominent French fleeing from Napoleon's army who came over in 1822. But essentially, he managed to make his fighting force and him as the commander-in-chief such a threat that those who didn't accept his suzerainty were happy to pay him vassalage for years to come. So he got the benefit of money, the financial servitude, rather than the actual physical conquering of these lands. So that was one very important part of the story. And I do think the other part was the fact that it's come up before in discussion. Okay, he was certainly the Maharaja, but he also projected an image of humility, which made him very popular amongst the people. He always tried to sort of come across as someone who was a servant of the Khalsa, even though he was the Maharaja. He tried not to alienate segments of society, like the masses, the cultivators who would pay him rent, pay him taxes. So the financial side was strong too. So this was a powerful military state based on, ironically, the consent of the people and indeed a love for Ranjit Singh, which is noted by all contemporaries.
So what's been said there, Susan Strong, takes us to his court. What was his court like? Because it seemed to me to run on two lines, one the majestic and the other the modest.
I think that's absolutely right. The central figure at the heart of this was this little grey mouse that you alluded to, the Ranjit Singh, who was not physically prepossessing because of the childhood smallpox which had left him blind. He was very small. He did not dress magnificently. He didn't seem to care, probably seeing himself in the ascetic line of the early gurus, perhaps. But the court itself was extremely splendid, and the Europeans who went to the court commented on the profusion of jewellery that was worn by these very tall, handsome chieftains who were leading the army.
By this time, is the turban being introduced?
Yes, well, it would have been worn by not just by Sikhs, but it was worn. They wore cashmere shawls. Cashmere shawls were extremely present in the court culture, huge exports of these brightly coloured crimson, yellow, green shawls that were worn not just as shawls but also as saddlecloths for the horses. They were used to line tents and so on. Ranjit Singh, nevertheless, despite his personal discreet, underdressed appearance, he didn't wear many jewels, could rise to the occasion when it was necessary. And so, for instance, when Mr. Macnaghten arrived in 1838 on a very delicate diplomatic mission and was greeted by Ranjit Singh in his summer palace with a garden outside, the paths to Ranjit Singh were lined by these very splendid Sikh warriors dressed in profusion of jewellery and red silk jackets, yellow silk jackets, and they led Macnaghten to Ranjit Singh, who was sitting on a golden throne wearing white muslin clothes and with the Kohinoor diamond on his arm and a famous long rope of pearls. And what's interesting about this is that at the same time you have the court history recording in incredible detail the preparations that Ranjit Singh made for meetings like this. So they were very carefully orchestrated. The Sikh Sardars were inspected beforehand. They were all lined up in the clothes and the jewellery that they were supposed to be wearing. The history records that notes were taken of the names of each man and the specific ornaments that he was wearing to check that they wore the same profusion of jewellery on the day. And there are all sorts of preparations like that are done very carefully, weeks ahead. The gifts that are going to be given to the visitors are very carefully selected and calibrated to the rank of each person arriving. So within this modesty, there is nevertheless a huge sense of the magnificence of the position of Ranjit Singh within this kingdom.
One of you mentioned Machiavellian. He wasn't going to be outsplendid by the Queen from England or her representatives, was he?
Not at all. I mean, he was aware of the importance of the Queen and the reign of the Queen Victoria in England and the strength of the East India Company, but he himself was also very conscious of who he was and who he represented, not only the Punjabis but also the Sikh tradition, as Susan has mentioned.
Can we go back a little more, which Chandrika mentioned, but just a little more about the army?
Yeah.
Because he had a distinctive, he was reported as being an intelligent conversationalist, even through translation. People picked that up, more than picked it up, obviously. But he would come back to the army. Whose army was this? That's from who? Can you tell us about how he organised his army?
Well, his army was, it grew out of the Sikh fighting forces in the 18th century, the clans and the missiles. But by the first decade of his reign, it had developed a modern dimension. In a sense, it comprised of the artillery, the cavalry, and the infantry. And it was by and large, the majority of the army comprised of Sikhs. But it also had Gurkhas, it had deserters from the East India Company, and as Chandrika's mentioned, it was led in part by some European officers who trained the army on modern lines in modern warfare. So Ranjit Singh was very conscious that if his state was to survive, he needed to modernize and develop modern warfare in order to counteract the growing power of the East India Company. But at the same time, he tried to adapt within it the elements which had given the Sikhs paramountcy in Punjab in the 18th century, namely the horse warriors who were kept by large landowners and so on. So he was very conscious of in building a military machine, he needed also to accommodate the key element, and in recognizing the fact that his military was for him the representation of this, Sarkari Khalsa, which is the militant tradition of Sikhism.
Chandrika, we've mentioned, I've speeded over once or twice, his approach to people from other religions. Could you develop that?
Yes, certainly. I think he saw himself as propagating the teachings of Sikhism as a good Sikh, which meant that he, both in terms of his civil and military administration, included men of all faith, but more importantly, in terms of the largesse of the state, in terms of giving financial grants and in recognizing, for instance, Hindu festivals, giving grants to Hindu temples like the Jwalamukhi temple in Kangra, or Muslim shrines like the Hazrat Bal in Kashmir. He was seen to be this benefactor who was equally generous across all religious communities. And certainly I think the fact that he did this for over 40 years meant that he built up a reputation as being someone who was for all faiths. And this served him very well in terms of loyalty, both in terms of the administration, the civil service, if you like, but also in the army. And it's quite interesting that, for instance, the artillery, which is really what came very close to defeating the British after his death in some of those state battles, was manned by Muslims. He made it very, very clear that he trusted them enough and they were trained in order to do this. But of course, those who were cynical would also point to the fact that he was doing this in order to ensure that the Sikh element within the Khalsa did not, achieve a dominance within the army. He was well aware of their capabilities. And
You've
he was
used the word Khalsa a few times. Can you just tell the listeners what it is?
Well, Khalsa really refers to, it means pure, but it really comes to refer by this time to the militarized wing of the Sikh polity. And essentially these were sort of like the Praetorian Guard, if you like, in the Roman Empire. They were the sort of the frontline troops who were the best trained, the most skilled horsemen, artillerymen, and so on. So they were a combination of the creme de la creme of the army. The Sikhs dominated the Khalsa, which is interesting in some aspects. But as I explained a moment ago, Ranjit Singh was very conscious of actually ensuring that there was a religious, if you like, spread of military power, which I think is really important.
Susan Strong, how did Ranjit Singh develop Amritsar?
Well, this was the Golden Temple, which was the site, as Gurharpal has said, which was originally a wooded place with a pool of water, which developed into the spiritual heart of Sikhism. And the structure at the centre of a pool was destroyed, as I mentioned earlier, repeatedly by the Afghans. So one of the first things that Ranjit Singh did, having become Maharaja, was to create a new structure. We don't know what the original structure looked like, but the structure which exists today owes its existence to Ranjit Singh. And this is partly where the Mughal legacy comes in, because the square building in the middle of this pool, surrounded by marble walkways, is in 2 stories. The lower story is clad in white marble, which is directly derived from Mughal architectural tradition, and also very beautifully inlaid with semi-precious stones, with flowers and animals and even figures, which you would never have in Mughal architecture. The upper story is clad in gilt copper, so it reflects against the waters of the pool, so you get this shimmering gold image. And then at the top of the building is a pavilion with the golden domes. And inside, of course, is the holy book, the Guru Granth Sahib. And this is the site of worship, and this is where Ranjit Singh went repeatedly as a devout Sikh. He travelled between Lahore and Amritsar very often to go to the Golden Temple.
And also at that time, because it seems when somebody of that authority and genius, one might say, gets in power, everything seemed to develop. There's a huge surge in commerce and in agriculture, and Amritsar became a rich town as well as a strategically and religiously important town.
It did, and that's the legacy of the stability. You know, if you have political stability, then the economic benefits follow, and that was in great part the success of the kingdom was because Ranjit Singh did manage to make it stable, treated people reasonably, was a just ruler, and so people followed him.
Gurharpal, how significant was the death of Ranjit Singh to the fortunes of the Sikh Empire?
Well, in one respect, it's very significant because the whole state and statecraft of Ranjit Singh was constructed around the individual. He was the genius who held the whole thing together. He was everything spun around him in terms of managing the warring sardars, the conflicts, in extending the empire, the diplomacy of the empire, and by the end of his, in a sense, if we turn this on its head, that was also the failing of Ranjit Singh, because in constructing such a state, he then can be pulled up short for not having, and this is, some Sikh historians criticising on the one hand for not institutionalising and building on the empire and creating the framework for further development, and others criticising for actually not living up to the Sikh tradition, and that his downfall, in a sense, can be ascribed to his deviation from the Sikh tradition and in accommodation of other religions and so on and so forth.
Did the British wait until Singh's death before waging war on the Sikhs?
Well, yes, indeed. I think there were other reasons.
Were they worried about him? They
were always worried about him. Yes, they were. And they reluctantly came to a treaty with him in 1809, by which they sort of agreed to not invade him, and Ranjit Singh was happy enough to act as the buffer as long as they didn't come and threaten his lands.
Against the Afghans.
Buffer against the Afghans.
The famous Afghans, who were always with us.
Indeed. But there was also other things happening. The East India Company had, by this time, as it happened, defeated other territories, like the Marathas, particularly. By 1819, they had managed to subdue the Marathas. They were now poised with a new, young Governor-General, Henry Harding, who had a military background. They were sort of poised in order to sort of take over the Punjab. So with the death of Ranjit Singh, this was the classic example of opportunism, where the East India Company were now ready to move. They'd been wanting to do so, and they did on the pretext of the Sikh army or the Sikh Khalsa invading territories beyond the Satluj. That was just a pretext in 1845.
And there were two very bloody and very, very close-run battles.
Indeed, and I would like to identify two. Both the first one in the First Anglo-Sikh War, which of course was Firozpur, where you had the Commander-in-Chief General Gough, who nearly lost the empire for the British by acts of omission and commission. But there was also a great sort of treachery on the part of some of the Sikh commanders, Lal Singh and Tate Singh in particular, who, when they found the British army almost on its knees, I mean, there were 50 plus European officers who'd been killed. Thousands of sepoys had been killed by, this was Firozpur, this was on the morning of the 21st of December. Instead of actually taking over and defeating the British finally, they decided to retreat. And there's always been controversy about why these Sikh commanders retreated. So I think the history would put it down to treachery combined with bad sort of judgment on the part of the Sikhs to not go for the kill. So the British sort of got away with a victory, the snatched victory from the jaws of defeat at Firozpur. And very quickly, Chillianwala Bagh in the second Afghan war was a second Anglo-Sikh war, was also equally bloody, and it nearly went the other way for the British. So it was a close-run thing, but they managed to defeat the Sikhs by 1849.
So, Susan, we have the Sikhs are defeated. The British are still very wary of them. They use them as a buffer state rather than, as I understand it. What happened to Ranjit Singh had left 8 children. Predictably, they fell out with each other. They got assassinated one after another. We know all about. Middle age. Never mind. What happened to the stuff that he had, the diamonds, the treasures, and so on?
Well, you end up with the British taking over, annexing the Punjab, and the nominal Maharaja is a little boy, Dalip Singh. And finally, with the annexation, Dalip Singh is separated from his mother, who was a very powerful influence.
He is young, as we're talking about.
He's a little boy, yeah.
Mm. I was looking for an age, that's all.
I can't remember.
5.
That's right.
Yes, that's right.
No, I think it wasn't.
He was
older.
5, and then he was.
Yes,
Yes.
at annexation
He was 10.
10. Yes, exactly.
And then he was.
Okay, we're back with little boy. Okay, let's go.
So he's taken into the care of Dr. John Logan, who is also given charge of the treasury and inventorying it and dispersing it. So Logan graciously gives Dalip Singh some of the treasures, some of the best textiles, and then sends some of the other star pieces back to England, including Ranjit Singh's Golden Throne, which was displayed in the East India Company's Indian Museum in London. The Kohinoor diamond is part of the Treaty of Lahore. That goes to Queen Victoria, is exhibited in the 1851 exhibition, disappoints the crowds, is recut, loses nearly half its weight. Other jewels which had been collected by Ranjit Singh and were still in the treasury equally go back to England. But most of
back is wrong. Go to England.
Go to England, sorry, yes, of course. So, and so what's left is auctioned in Lahore in a series of sales, and so it's lost because we have no idea who bought it, where it went. Some of it was certainly bought by English collectors in India, but the rest would be dispersed through a network, presumably of Indian dealers.
Gopal, how well positioned were the Sikh people at the end of empire? Let's say they've now faced 2 defeats by the East India Company's army, which is bigger than the British army at the time. How well placed were? What were they doing? How did they react? How did they regroup, if they did?
Well, immediately after the annexation of Punjab and the 2 defeats, there was a great deal of disillusionment. Naturally so, because an empire had disappeared. Those in arms had been disarmed, and many in the military wandered, across the province and were often unemployed or without a job. And the first 10 years or so were quite difficult for the Sikh community because they were the ruling class, as it were, in Punjab. What changed the fortunes to some extent was the Indian Mutiny, or the Indian War of Independence, or the First War of Indian Independence, as Indians like to call it. In that, the Sikhs were were called on to provide support to the East India Company, and subsequently in the 19th century we see the whole policy of the recruitment into the Indian Army changing, and Sikhs are recruited in large numbers. So that, in a sense, restores some of the fortunes of the community, but it's still not at the level it was before annexation.
They become a very important part, I can't use the word backbone because I don't know enough about it, of the Indian Army. And then, of course, in the First and Second World Wars, the Sikhs join in with the British and are very, very effective as part of those two wars. Can we spend the last 2 or 3 minutes talking about the legacy of this extraordinary man? Starting with you, Chandrika, if we can go around the table. What was his greatest legacy, Ranjit Singh?
I would say the idea that he nurtured of a regional, national identity which transcended religion. He was seen at the time and subsequently as someone who stood for all of Punjab, the Lion of Punjab.
And that persists?
I certainly think it does. I think this identity is very strong, and it isn't Sikh, it is a Punjabi identity, and it transcends, it includes within it people from all communities. So Punjabi Muslims too, and Hindus, Punjabi Hindus. I mean, this is an idea that is rooted, I think, in the time of the first, the great Sikh Empire, the first and only.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think he was a representative of what one might want to say as a Punjabi nationalism in its best sense. But I would also add that his greatest legacy was Punjabi militarism. In creating a state around a military meritocracy, he then left a legacy which was taken over by the Indian Army, and one could conceivably argue that the current day Pakistan is state is, in a sense, epitomizes Ranjit Singh and his legacy.
And finally, I'm afraid, briefly, Susan.
Well, I'd say I think he should be seen as a great figure in world history for all the reasons that Chandrika and Gurharpal have said, but also there's the architectural legacy, of course, of the Golden Temple.
Well, thank you all very much. As Gurharpal Singh, Chandrika Kaul and Susan Strong. Next week we will be talking about the neutron, which was discovered in Cambridge in 1932. Thanks for listening.
And the In Our Time podcast gets some extra time now with a few minutes of bonus material from Melvin and his guests.
So what did we miss out? Anything significant?
I would have liked to said something about the creation of the Khalsa by the 10th Guru, because I think that's seminal to understanding what the Khalsa is.
Yeah.
So
why don't you tell us now, the fortunate people who are downloading this?
Okay. After the persecution of the 5th Guru, we have his son then adopts 2 swords. The 6th Guru adopts the sword which represents temporal power and spiritual power, and that, in a sense, is a defining moment for the transformation of Sikhism into a political force. But the 10th Guru in 1699 creates the Khalsa. He creates the new order, which is supposed to embody the Sikh tradition and represents the pure. He baptizes the Khalsa in the Shivalik Hills in current-day Anandpur Sahib, and then is in turn baptized himself. So this identity is seen to represent the new order within Sikhism,
with the equality of the sexes,
with the equality of the 5, and it's also embodied in the dress code, the keeping of unshorn hair, and so forth. And upon the death of the 10th Guru in 1708, he lays down that the Guruship is ended and is invested in the Adi Granth, the holy book. But he himself, before he dies, says he would also be present in the mystical entity of the Khalsa. So in a sense, you have the twin doctrine of the Guru Granth and the Guru Panth, and that the Guru Panth and the presence of the Khalsa seems to be the spirit which then provides the drive towards rule. Because there's a prophecy of the 10th Guru that the Khalsa will eventually rule. And the Ranjit Singh state is seen to be the culmination of that prophecy a century later.
Can I just quickly add two images to that sort of point? One is the way the iconography associated with the last guru. You know, he's often portrayed on a stallion with a dove in one hand and a glittering sort of saber in the other. You know, as just sort of symbolizing this coming together of these two traditions. And the other image I'd like to point out is at Amritsar. Now, Susan talked about the temple, but opposite that there is something called the Akal Takht, which is a meeting place. It's like a centre where every year the leaders used to meet to discuss politics. So this combination of the spiritual and the political, which is at the heart of the Khalsa Sikh tradition, is epitomized by Amritsar. And I think that has had all kinds of repercussions in modern politics, modern Indian politics. We're not going to go into that. But I think that's really essential to understanding where the strength of the polity came from.
There are many more history and discussion programmes from Radio 4 to download for free. Find these on the website at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.